Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And we're recording this half of Newscast on Thursday evening, and it's just about 10:30. And this evening, Chris and I have been glued to our TV screens because Fiona Bruce was in Makerfield hosting a classic format of Question Time, but in a non-classic way, because the panel was made up of 5 candidates in the Makerfield by-election. There was Andy Burnham for Labour, Robert Kenyon for Reform UK, Michael Winstanley for the Conservatives, Jake Austin for the Liberal Democrats, and Sarah Wakefield for the Green Party. And Chris, the first sort of 20 minutes of the programme was just all on one question about how could they restore trust in politicians.
Yes, and therefore ended up being dominated by 2 themes. Firstly, the most obvious theme, because you can see it from the International Space Station, which is why is this by-election happening, and Andy Burnham's ambitions and the future of the Labour Party and who might be the next Prime Minister, etc., etc. And the extent to which that is either a noble thing to do or causing a by-election unnecessarily, and there was a fair smattering of arguments in both directions there. And then for his principal rival in this contest, which is Robert Kenyon and Reform UK, the whole slew of questions that there have been that we were talking about on the last edition of By-Election Cast, after my conversation with Mr. Kenyon the other day, around his extensive kind of social media posting history and, you know, what that says about him as a character.
And then towards the end of that section, Andy Burnham then confirmed something that basically everyone knew, but he'd never actually said before, which is that if he wins in Makerfield, he would join a contest to succeed Keir Starmer as Prime Minister.
I'm not somebody who gets ahead of myself. I can't do anything unless I'm lucky enough to get the support of people here. But if I get your support, I would seek to represent you at the highest possible level and give this constituency maximum power and influence. I think Wes Streeting seems to have launched a leadership contest. So if that is running, I would seek to join it, but I'd have to persuade members of the Parliamentary Labour Party to do the same.
So yeah, Chris, there we go.
Yeah. So look, how should we tease that apart? I mean, look, you know, Fiona Bruce wasn't in Ashton in Makerfield because the dart in the Question Time office had just happened at random to hit Ashton rather than Devizes or Dundee or Carlisle or Ipswich. Look, clearly, obviously, Andy Burnham has ambitions, but he's been pretty coy, hasn't he, in public about those in the last couple of weeks. I think, firstly, grounded in a genuine, I think, respect of putting one foot in front of another and taking one step at a time. In other words, look, it is obvious what his ambitions are, but he's got to persuade people in Makerfield first, and he doesn't want to either look presumptuous to folk in the constituency or necessarily in the wider Labour Party. But I think what was significant about what you just heard is he, perhaps only by a smidgen, given that, you know, all of what is obvious anyway, he did go a little bit further. One thing I would emphasise, and certainly his team are emphasising from that extract that you heard there, is he talked about entering a contest, which is different from triggering a contest. So lots of people have reflected in the last, not just the last month, the last 6 or 7 months about the Labour leadership, which is that in the end, for a Prime Minister to change, somebody has to stick their head above the parapet and trigger a formal contest, and then a contest begins, or the Prime Minister has to say, I've had enough, and then the act of his resignation itself would trigger a contest. And Andy Burnham's language there was quite carefully chosen around entering a leadership contest were there to be one, which is distinct from triggering it.
Which in theory gives Wes Streeting some leverage over Andy Burnham, because if Andy Burnham would be relying on Wes to trigger the contest, then Wes can say, well, okay, what do I get if I do that favour for you? Just theorising.
Exactly, completely. All of that then becomes a sort of all of that is perfectly reasonable theorising, I think.
Yeah, and then in terms of reaction to what Andy Andy Burnham has been intending to do. Michael Winstanley, the Conservative Party candidate, said that this by-election had been foisted on people in Makerfield because of Andy Burnham's ambitions. And Jake Austin for the Liberal Democrats said this was basically an election for a future Prime Minister via the back door, and that Andy Burnham had been saying the quiet part out loud, finally. Right, somebody who was watching it was obviously in number 10 Downing Street, though, Chris, because there was, during the programme being aired, a statement released basically saying Starmer's going nowhere.
Yeah, so they were definitely watching in Downing Street as the programme played out on the BBC News channel and on the iPlayer, because it went out then at 9 o'clock and then it was going out on BBC One after the 10 o'clock news. And unsolicited, or at least I hadn't sought to solicit this response, maybe others had, we got something at 9:45 that we've heard this before, but it had sufficiently goaded, the clip we've just heard of Andy Burnham had sufficiently goaded number 10 to put out a quote in the name of a number 10 spokesman, talking about what they see as Keir Starmer's achievements, talking about not getting distracted by Westminster debates. I mean, seems like they were distracted by one tonight, but anyway, we won't get too drawn into that.
Maybe multitasking.
Yeah, exactly. You can do more than one thing at once, can't you? And then they say, and this line will seem familiar, the Labour Party has a process for challenging a leader and it has not been triggered. The Prime Minister will not walk away from the mandate he was given just 2 years ago. And just to cap off that point I was making a moment or two ago about some of the reflections I've heard in the last 6, 7, 8, 9 months about the Labour leadership, is that the alternative to your hypothesis about, where does that leave West Streeting in a scenario where Andy Burnham wins the by-election, if nobody moves, nothing happens. And I'm not saying that is likely. Who knows? Let's see how the next couple of weeks play out. There's so many different ramifications. But there is a central truth there. If nobody moves, nothing happens. And for all of the heat last month in the immediate aftermath of the elections, and there was a lot of it, nobody moved in the end. Now, West Streeting made an argument that he could have done but chose not to. Others wondered if he had the numbers, etc., etc. But there was no formal triggering of a contest. And given what Andy Burnham has said, the specifics of what he said, let's see how these next few weeks shake out.
And because Team Starmer were watching this edition of Question Time so closely, they also will have heard a member of the Question Time audience give this quite withering assessment of Keir Starmer.
I want the sooner the better that Keir Starmer walks out of Downing Street, the better for me and everybody else. We want him to go. Everybody wants him to go. We can't stand him, actually. But he's not for the people
just say
anyway.
what you really think.
Because he's not for the people. He doesn't listen. That's his downfall.
Yes, so at least one member of the audience who is very, very angry and can't wait to get rid of Keir Starmer. So,
and just on that, Adam, just one little observation, because as she was making that observation, Robert Kenyon said, "But he'll be gone anyway," and I think it's an interesting interjection, and it gets to an element of the conversations that the candidates, particularly the principal two, Reform and Labour, are having with voters. Because how, if you are a voter in the Makerfield constituency, how are you meant to deal with the conundrum, if you feel this as a conundrum, of how do I vote if I want to see the Prime Minister change? Because it's almost counterintuitive to think, I'm not happy with Labour and therefore I'll endorse Labour at the election, even though the pitch of the Labour candidate is vote for me because I want to change Labour. And Reform have just gone through a whole election cycle last month where they were saying vote for us to get rid of Keir Starmer. And so in response to a very bluntly put assessment, withering assessment of the actual Prime Minister right now from the audience member we just heard, who had also said just in an earlier in that sort of paragraph or whatever out loud that she was backing Andy Burnham, you had that chipping in from Mr. Kenyon, trying to say, to neutralise that point, to say that you don't need to vote for him in order to get rid of the Prime Minister.
Right, then on to Robert Kenyon, the Reform candidate, and he was asked by a member, it was more of a comment by a member of the audience who said she'd rather have a career politician as the MP than a plumber who is a sexist. And that's a reference to some now deleted tweets that Robert Kenyon had posted many years ago, some of them, including one that's become quite infamous, where and this is where it comes a little bit convoluted. Somebody had posted a really sexist comment about Carol Vorderman's anatomy. Somebody else had flagged that on Twitter and called it out. But Robert Kenyon had then replied to that person saying, yeah, along the lines of, yeah, but we're all thinking it. He's just saying what we're thinking. Robert Kenyon refused to apologise for that when he was challenged to by the Green candidate, Sarah Wakefield, who did one of those things that's quite an effective technique in debates, which is to say to the opponent, look in the camera and apologise, and then if they don't do it, they don't look great in their eyes. That was a quite dramatic moment. But Robert Kenyon said what he said before, which is that he'd said some crass things, but they were a long time ago, and he wouldn't say them now.
Yeah, it was quite something. And in saying that she'd spoken to Carol Vorderman, and as you say,
yes, because Carol Vorderman had called her up.
Yeah, so they had spoken. Carol Vorderman is at the heart of one of these, one of the number of rows that there's been that have led to this suggestion, these allegations of sexism against Robert Kenyon. And as you say, that invitation to look down the barrel of the camera, which was almost like an invitation to do the thing that Nick Clegg did way back in 2010 in that first set of prime ministerial debates, where he tried to sort of address the audience at home rather than the audience in the room by staring down the barrel of the camera. But there's the broader point here, Adam, that I was reflecting on, and I may have mentioned this on the last episode, so apologies if I'm repeating myself. But if we stand back and look in on that question time, you had Andy Burnham, who's been a politician in frontline politics for 30 odd years, and then the other people around the table. The Conservative has been in local politics for a very long time, but a good number of the others are very new to politics. And then, in the blink of an eye, find themselves on Question Time and taking questions from Fiona.
In a sort of quasi-prime ministerial debate.
Well, exactly. And they've got Carol Vorderman on the phone, and that's just quite a thing. And that asymmetry could cut both ways, because you could have there were people there on the panel for whom it would have been a kind of, blimey, what am I doing here kind of thing. And yet for Andy Burnham, there would have been a danger if he imagined it was a Question Time like the many others he's appeared on, where he's alongside, broadly speaking, other politicians of similar kind of clout or experience or national profile or whatever, of the danger of being, I don't know, patronising or coming across as seeking to stand above others when they're all contesting the same seat and barely a vote has been cast, etc., etc.
Although Andy Burnham sort of almost acted like the other candidates weren't there, apart from the Conservative, who was sat next to him at the desk, and also is somebody he's known in local politics for a long time.
Yes.
Then, in terms of other issues, there was a big conversation about people's reactions to the death of Henry Novak, a subject we've discussed quite a lot on Newscast this week after the emergence of the police body cam footage. Robert Kenyon was asked about it, and I thought his response here was interesting because it was slightly different from how Nigel Farage had reacted to it in Parliament on Wednesday. Here is Robert Kenyon being asked about that by a member of the Question Time audience.
I'd just like to ask, in terms of Nigel Farage not condemning the violence that went on the other evening, would Rob care to condemn it this evening?
Okay, let me just briefly allow you to do that if you want to. You're being asked, do you want to condemn the violence that took place in Southampton?
100% condemn the violence. Violence is not the answer to this. What we need to do is make sure we do it politically, and we reforms policies to get 30,000 extra police officers on the street, and ban knives, regardless of religious background, that we ban knives completely.
And Chris, the point of difference I felt there with Farage, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that on Wednesday in Parliament, when Farage was asking his question to Keir Starmer about this, about two-tier policing, so-called, in his view, lots of the MPs around him were saying, condemn the violence that happened in Southampton, that some people say was a product of what Farage had said on Tuesday morning. Robert Kenyon actually seemed to be much more explicitly condemnatory of that.
Without question, and not in a mild-mannered way. He said 100%. Violence is not the answer, and that he condemned the scenes that we saw in Southampton the other night. So he maintained an argument that he believed there was, as he put it, the two-tier policing, but was absolutely unequivocal in condemning that violence. And I think it speaks to a trend that we've seen, and different voices in Reform will say different things or put it in their own words, etc., etc. But if you sort of run a trend line through Reform's remarks in the last few days, days around all of this. In the last 24 hours or so, since Prime Minister's questions, I do think there's been an attempt to just dial things down a bit. And, rewinding to earlier on Thursday, when the Novak family had been to see Kemi Badenoch and been to see the Prime Minister, Reform's statement acknowledged that they'd been in touch with the family, but they hadn't yet had a meeting. And clearly there's been a bit of a backlash from some about Reform and Nigel Farage's choice of language and his approach. Their argument is that, of course, they're going to get ganged up on in Parliament in particular because there's hardly any of them versus everyone else. But perhaps out in the country they are speaking to a chunk of the electorate who would say absolutely right, they're on the right track.
And then Andy Burnham's response to all of that was to talk about the record of Greater Manchester Police, because, of course, he's got some responsibility for that as the mayor of Greater Manchester.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting because there was a nuance here around Andy Burnham's perspective, grounded in his recent experience. He was full of praise, went out of his way to praise Sir Stephen Watson, who's Manchester's Chief Constable, talking about him being one of the outstanding police leaders of his generation. Made me wonder if one day were Andy Burnham to become the Prime Minister, whether we could see Sir Stephen running the Met. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. I wonder if Mark Rowley was watching Question Time. Anyway, and what was interesting about Andy Burnham's pitch here was that when Sir Stephen had been recruited to run Greater Manchester Police, he had made a pitch, the new Chief Constable then, this is going back a few years ago, that he didn't want, for instance, rainbows related to pride, for instance, on police cars. He wanted to be absolutely certain that the accusation of two-tier policing could not stick in Greater Manchester. And some were uncomfortable with that because they might reflect on their own experiences with the police and think that was a viable and sensible thing to do, that sort of leaning into some of those arguments and campaigns. But it was Sir Stephen's view that was a mistake, and he pulled back from it. And Andy Burnham said he backed him when he was meeting resistance, and that's how you deal with it. So I think Andy Burnham was attempting to make an argument that said, in his view, it doesn't exist in Greater Manchester, but he could understand why there might be a perception that it exists elsewhere.
And of course, Keir Starmer famously took the knee in his office in Parliament with Angela Rayner.
Yeah, and he did say, did Keir Starmer yesterday, on Wednesday, that he didn't believe there was two-tier policing in the UK.
And then for the Liberal Democrats, Jake Austin was quite passionate about the EU, but a bit like Andy Burnham, not as passionate as maybe would have sounded before. And his emphasis was on the fact that the Liberal Democrats want to rejoin the customs union or have a customs union with the EU to boost economic growth, as opposed to going all the way back in as a member, which maybe they want to do ultimately much further down the line. But Jack Austin then said that hadn't been coming up on the doorsteps very often. And in fact, rather than kind of big foreign policy things, as might challenge a future Prime Minister, we had more talk about the new houses being built by the Sainsbury's, by the which junction was it? They said it was Junction 25.
Yeah, it's a massive issue in the patch. It's a really big issue in the patch, and it's one of those where there'll be a resonance for newscasters, perhaps wherever you are listening to us. That whole societal conundrum about, do we build anywhere near enough homes? The whole question that can be sprung about, why so many more homes are needed, and then where do you put them, and is the necessary infrastructure attached to them so that there are school places and doctor surgery places and roads and parking and all of that. And very significant contribution, I think, locally to a lot of the conversations going on. Robert Kenyon for Reform saying it's what got him into politics. Andy Burnham telling a story about a new housing development going back a while where there was a flooding of the housing development before anybody had even moved in. It's and the whole question about brownfield sites versus greenfield sites, etc., really big talking point locally, and a pretty passionate set of exchanges, albeit one requiring a pretty intense knowledge of the geography of those communities to the south of Wigan to entirely follow every twist and turn of it.
And Michael Winstanley for the Tories gave us a very detailed explanation of the formation of the Greater Manchester Spatial Plan, which I was very grateful
read,
for.
Actually, it's the sort of thing you'd have in a Lever Arch file.
No, I decided to go on some mapping software to see where the houses next to the Sainsbury's are going to go.
I
instead.
see.
So I only had limited time between the end of question time and the start of this.
Fair dues.
And as is tradition, we're going to end by-election cast with a celebrity reading out all the names of the candidates in that by-election. I'm pleased to say today it is 5 Live football commentating legend, John Murray.
Hi, Adam and newscasters. It's John Murray, and I'm here to read out the 14 candidates standing in the Makerfield by-election on Thursday, the 18th of June. In alphabetical order, the candidates are Jake Austin, Liberal Democrats; Count Binface, Count Binface Party; Andy Burnham, the Labour Party; Dan Clark, the Libertarian Party; John Dyer, Independent; Ed Gemmell, Climate Party; Paul Gould, Independent; Alan Howlin Lord Hope, the official monster raving loony party; Robert Kenyon, Reform UK; Robert Pownall, Independent; Rebecca Shepherd, Restore Britain; Sarah Wakefield, Green Party; Peter Ward, Rejoin EU; Michael Winstanley, the Conservative Party. And that same full list of candidates, plus loads more information about the Makerfield by-election, is available on the BBC website